the government should pay for everything. Specifically, the question of paying for things that you have responsibility to pay for. I'll give you a couple of examples here. If you have children, they're your children.
They certainly are.
You need to look after them, including pay for things for them. If you get married, you have a responsibility for your spouse. And as a husband, as I am, I have a responsibility to look after my wife, to protect her, to make sure that she's cared for. But the government is forever offering and sometimes demanding to step in. Isn't this a problem? The strapline at the head of our show is, we look out at the news from a Christian worldview point of view. The Christian worldview surely sees the family as the central bit of government. That's the way you govern your lives. Not a national government stepping in and helping you out. And, of course, by helping you out, also telling you what to do.
Well, it certainly takes that opportunity, yes.
This is the question I'm making. So if the government is in that position of offering, say, we'll take education of them, and you say, well, no, they're my children, I will educate them as I want to, don't you think that the government should give you back your money? It takes money in taxation to pay for education,
yes.
so I don't want you to do that.
Yes, certainly I would be thinking about that if I were in that situation. Yes.
I took two of my children out of school for different lengths of time. During that time, I had to pay for them to be educated.
You were paying twice over,
while still paying tax, yes. I was paying tax, so paying for other people's children to be educated. But mine I took out. Now, the law hasn't changed. It's still the case that you can do this. All I did was I wrote to the headmaster of the school and said, I will be educating my child, gave the name, otherwise than at school. That's the legal phrase you could use. You don't have to say anything else. In fact, it's best not to say anything else, because you're making claims you could be held to. You just say, that's all I'm going to do. Now, the local authority does have the right to check that you are educating them. But it doesn't.
I suppose that's reasonable.
But it doesn't have the right to tell you how to educate them, just that you are doing it.
Why are they so concerned about whether you are educating your children or not?
Well, it seems a bit strange, doesn't it? There are a few claims that have been made here. One is, if you don't get the government's help, you might not be able to educate them very well. Well, let me just answer that. I've seen how government-led education works. I think I can do a better job.
Okay.
I think most people can. And the problem is that, of course, it's government education. You end up with big schools catering, inevitably, even with attempts at streaming and other forms of teaching like that, you end up aiming at the middle of ability range. So people who are not so bright, people who are very, very bright, don't get catered for very well. That's just one example of how it's not individual enough. But also, and I think that we can take this to apply to all the things we're talking about, using education as an example. The government doesn't love my children.
No, it wants to manipulate them.
It should be out of love that you are looking after people, that you're giving. It's the same looking after your husband or wife. It comes out of love that you look after them. Maybe it's in terms of giving money or providing resources. Maybe it's actually physically caring, but it's done out of love. It's the way that society is intended to be run. That's the biblical way, I would say.
Yes, and I suppose the task of educating the children would be down to the mother in this case.
When we're talking about essential education, to just get on in the world, you need to know how to read and write.
Yes.
You need to know how to cook for yourself. You need to know how to cross the road. There's various things you need to learn.
Yes, there are social aims.
Yes, there's what's sometimes called a social contract. You need to know how to behave in society in order to get on. And your family can teach you that.
Can they? Because just recently I came across a case where a mother and father are suing the government because the government did not treat their daughter properly. Apparently she grew very anxious and they were unable to cope with her behaviour because of her anxiety. It turned out she had autism. And
they're suing the government.
And they're suing the government because the government didn't do anything about it.
Oh, right. That's interesting, isn't it? Now, I don't know the details of that case, but I do think that how your child is treated is, first of all, parental responsibility.
Yes.
But the problem with that is the government has taken money out of in taxation, saying it's going to do it, and enforces this, often by soft enforcement. You almost don't question the fact that you have to send your children to school, a government school. Even after primary education, what we were talking about earlier is primary education, so basic things of how to get on in the world. Secondary education, when you start studying academic subjects and what should be fitting you for work, really, it's not achieving what I think people hoped it would achieve. So I don't think that's necessary for most of people. Well, secondary education isn't necessary. If you've got a certain job, you could train on the job.
So would you make the age of leaving primary education higher?
Yes. My thinking is that something like 13.
And from then on, a child should be able to go out to work and
part of
get
the family.
Education that way.
Yeah, it's part of the family. They're not going to go off and get married. But they can start an education in a school. Yeah, I'm talking about more freedom.
Yeah. Okay. I was thinking about the kind of things that they would learn about.
Well, you may want to learn, or it may be good. Maybe even the majority need to learn them. But for some, it's absolutely pointless staying on learning these subjects past that age. It's not doing you any good. You'd be better getting experience working.
You could have half and half.
Exactly, yeah. You could have all different flexible arrangements, which would be far better for most people. And this sort of anxious behaviour, or the lot of anxiety, I believe, there have been studies on this, so I can't quote them to you this moment, but I think if listeners were to look them up, they'd see that a lot of anxiety is produced by others' expectations on you, an expectation on you that you can never achieve. And it produces anxiety and sometimes produces aggression and sometimes depression. When you're not academically inclined, you're maybe not that intelligent, the majority of people don't understand complex abstract ideas.
Agree with you there.
In the same way, there are other things that change across a population, like height. Most people can't reach a basketball ring just by stretching up, but some people can. I can't. And yet I can understand abstract ideas to a reasonably complex level. So I think that I should have stayed on till I was 16.
Because you would have been able to self-administrate your education.
Well, it wouldn't alienate me because I could understand what was going on. But it's in no way morally better to study an academic subject than it is to study a practical subject. And in terms of my ability, you see, would it have been any good for me studying metalwork? Well, no, I could have been pretty lethal. I'm terrible at that sort of thing. Keep Peter clear of the lathe, people would be saying, you know. Don't let him near that thing. Send him off to read some books. And the same can be true vice versa. My experience, you see, of teaching is that forcing people to think in that way about things that they will never understand, it actually seems to physically hurt them. It's like a torture, and you should stop doing it. Now, why would you end up in that position? Because the government's running it, and so it's one size fits all. And it's the same for everything. You see, when we give money voluntarily to an organisation to help people, we call it charity. Charitable giving. But charity means love, doesn't it?
Yes.
And I think that's the way it has to be done. Not these big charities. Local charities are good. Just giving to people that you know, supporting people you know through your family and friends is the way to care for people, not through government programs. I'm saying that's the Christian way because it's the loving way. Yes. What do you make of that, Beryl? Have I gone too far? Am I being too sentimental?
I don't know. I feel a bit ambivalent about this topic because I've experienced education. I was educated in a grammar school and I didn't necessarily enjoy it. I enjoyed the subjects that I enjoyed and disliked the subjects I disliked.
I'm not just asking about education. I'm talking about all the government provides, all these big schemes. Yes, there's education, but there's also healthcare. What else does the government survive for you?
Prisons families. To keep you safe.
Lock them in prisons. We're talking about sort of family support. So they give you money as a single mother, not you, but a single mother. We give them money so that they can not have to bother having a man. I think that they should get out. The government needs to get out of that. That's my opinion, to get out of all these big social programs.
Right. There would be some children of 13 or so who could not be left to their own devices. We'll go
back to education, yes.
But not only that, socially they could not be left.
That's right. There were all sorts of things that could be dealt with by people voluntarily getting together. When I took my children out of school, the letter I sent to the headmaster said, otherwise than at school. So time is spent at, but there's also groups. People get together. They sometimes call them homeschoolers, but they're not in the home. They might be in a museum or in a forest school. There's quite a movement of forest schools across the country. You learn stuff, but in the woods, so you've got a lot of outdoor activity and through practical stuff.
Could you include private schools in that?
Absolutely.
In a private school?
You could choose to teach your child in exactly the same way that the government does, if you wanted to. We're all going to sit in ranks, and there's a teacher at the front. I'm exaggerating. I know a lot of teachers are more creative than that, so,
It seems very few children sit at desks.
Yeah, things have improved in that matter. But what you're doing is fighting it as a teacher there. You're fighting against the system, coming up with creative ways to teach children. They'd be better off not being in school in the first place. You can do it together as groups. You can't expect someone to teach physics who doesn't know any physics, or you can't expect me to teach French, for example.
No.
People have different skills, but you work together to do it voluntarily, not being forced to go to the local school. That would be my suggestion. But that's schooling specifically. There are other things. I struggled to find what the government does, and in the moment I thought, hang on, we're paying them tax because they do things, I would say. We're paying too much tax because they do things that they shouldn't be taking on to themselves, onto the government.
And what about these groups? Children getting into groups, they'd have to have an adult supervising them. What about that adult? How do they look after themselves in terms of upkeep?
Well, one way would be for you to pay them.
But then that would be sort of getting back to the idea of school.
As I said, I'm not against school. It's nothing to do with school.
No.
My point is that the government shouldn't be involved.
You'd be paying not tax, but you'd be paying somebody who was monitoring this group out of your own income.
Yeah, let's put it another way. You treat other things like healthcare, childcare, education, you treat that in the same way as you treat food. Now, in communist countries, in Soviet Russia, for example, you could only buy food from the government shop.
Yeah.
This was terrible. You remember the bread lines. They didn't do it very well. We don't even attempt that in this country. If you want food and you want it cheap, you might even want it delivered on time efficiently, you get a supermarket to do it, which is a private entity. You choose to pay them. You don't have to pay them.
No, you can't obtain the service unless you pay them.
Yes, but you could get your food a different way. You could grow it. You could do whatever you wanted to do to get the food. It's entirely up to you. And what food you have is up to you. You can say, no, I like my vegetables from this grocer in Newcastle. You could drive over from Liverpool and get it. If you wanted to, you can do whatever you want. The government doesn't organise it. And the government not organise it. If you just think about how efficient supermarkets are.
Yes, they're very
Because
efficient.
they're in competition.
But you have another problem then, that people will eat the things that they like rather than the things they don't like.
Yeah.
Would that be good for them?
If they eat things that are bad for them, that will be bad for them.
The government is trying to get people to give up sugar at the moment.
Yeah. No, but what I would say is, it's not up to the government. It shouldn't have the authority to tell you what to eat. It shouldn't have the authority to tell you what your children should be taught. It shouldn't have to have the authority to tell you what your relationship is with your wife or husband. It shouldn't have any of that. It should keep out. The family is the building block. That's government. We do need to relate to each other. And I think that there is such a thing as individual government. You're responsible for your own life. But then the together part of it is in families. The government, a national government, needs to provide certain things. Of course, it needs to provide the security. It needs to stop if you invade it. They tax you because there's no choice. You're on the land. They've got to defend you, so you're taxed. If one person doesn't pay, you still get protected. I think it's fair enough to tax for an army. I think it's fair enough because I would prefer even that was voluntary. And I would have zero income tax.
And so would the courts not be more full of people who didn't want to pay even a minimal level of tax or security set?
If it's just a small amount, you're more likely to be happy to pay it. But I think there shouldn't be income tax. I think that's a big mistake, income tax. And there's a belief that income tax has always been there. But that's not true. It's a relatively modern invention. I think it was the Napoleonic Wars, which is going back a bit. In America, it's even more recent because some of the states don't levy income tax at all. There is no income tax. There's the federal income tax, but so it's not always necessary. The problem is when the government tries to do too much. So I'm quite didactic about that because this is my opinion. That's what the Bible's teaching. The Bible is not teaching that the government tells you what to do and then looks after you and holds your hand through life. You and your family are responsible.
Yes, I've been pondering lately, and part of the reason this theme in our podcast, because the question was asked, should we look after our spouse?
Yes.
Towards the end of our lives?
Yes.
Because I would say it's extremely difficult to look after somebody who has dementia, who is liable to go wandering off if you're not there.
Yeah, very difficult,
and so on. And unfortunately, both of my parents suffered from that condition at the end of their lives.
Yeah. Very difficult, yeah.
And it was a very sad time, but no way could my sister or I have looked after them.
I think as an individual, you shouldn't be expected to look after them.
I was more than an individual. I was a daughter.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that you personally are doing everything. If you weren't taxed so that you had all your income, you'd be better placed to be able to look after your parents if they go into that position.
Not if I didn't have an income.
No, not if you didn't have an income, no.
Which I wouldn't have if I stayed at home to look after them.
Yeah, well, that would be your choice. You could decide to do that. But then your husband would be then presumably looking after you.
But if he had his own parents to look after, you take my point, I think.
I see your point that you need help, but the problem is we're in the system now of government providing almost everything.
Well, because dementia is regarded as an illness.
If we were out of that system so that we were back in the time, which we used to have, where charitable organisations would have been doing the help that you're talking about there, then you wouldn't be having it through tax. It wouldn't be the government intervening. It would be charities
yes,
intervening.
And so that would be on the same basis as the education for older children.
What is the Peter Cooper interpretation of the Bible on this?
Yes.
I think the Bible is teaching you to help each other, but it has to be voluntary. The distinction is that the national government takes money off you at the point of the gun. You have to pay your taxes, and then spends it on what it thinks you should do. Effectively, it takes your money off you and then spends it for you how it thinks. Whereas what I'm saying is you should keep that money and then spend it how you think. But if the government's still taxing you, you don't have enough money then.
No.
You have to rely on the government. For example, I would have to rely on the NHS to be looked after. I don't have that amount of money to spend on healthcare because it's been taken off me.
Yes.
I think we're not quite agree. I think you think there is still a role for government, is what you're saying, in some cases.
Yes, because I don't think society matches up.
Well, I agree with you there. Mine is a sort of an aim, how I would like it to be. If I were king of the world, this is how it would run. But Christ is king of the world. A lot of people don't recognise him, so it's not run in his way. So I would go further. If you think about what we're saying about government intervening, it seems to always end up with it being worse. That's what I'm saying. It's because that isn't how it should be done. So in terms of voting politically, if someone is proposing big government, more and more intervention, they're taxing you more, but they're providing more, then always vote against them because they are going to ruin your life. And in the end, the country will go bankrupt.
You would have to abstain, actually, from voting.
At the moment you would, because there isn't anyone. You might end up voting for a minor party, but you say, well, there's just the choice of two, like between Conservative and Labour in England. But neither of those are providing any solutions. Just to be political for a moment, just take the current situation with our Conservative government. Over the past 3 years, they spent huge amounts of money. They thought they knew how best to stop a disease from passing, which was spread by coughing on each other. Because the government intervened and took our money to do so, we're now in a huge crisis, and they're now asking us to bail them out by asking us to pay more tax. So my mantra is that of Ronald Reagan, the scariest 9 words in the English language are, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. Because that's immediately a problem, and Ronald Reagan, although he didn't succeed in this, he tried at least to reduce the size of government, and I agree. So Reaganomics all the way. That's what I think. But what does the listener think? What do you think about that? Say, let us know. Contact us, flamesccr@gmail.com. That'll get to the station. Or go to our podcast page. You can leave comments there. You just go to berylandpete.com. Make sure you're subscribed and leave a comment there on every episode. We'd love to hear from you.